Welcome to Courageous Conversations. Before we start today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I thank the Aboriginal people for their custodianship of the land. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people joining us today. Courageous Conversations encourages individuals, organisations and communities to have conversations that challenge sexist comments, discrimination and disrespectful behaviour. Through these discussions and actions, we can create a culture that is free from rigid gender stereotypes and a community where all men and women and boys and girls feel safe, included and respected. During this program, we encourage you to consider what gender equity and respect means to you and to your community. This is Session 1, Courageous Conversations.
Hi, thanks for joining this session today. My name's Jules, Jasper is a louse. I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a mother and I'm a wife. And I'm also the Area Manager of Western Sydney for Mission Australia. And today we're going to be talking about Courageous Conversations. Courageous Conversations is about creating a safe and inclusive space to talk about the reality of violence and abuse against women. I'm here to talk about that with Liam.
Hi, my name's Liam Dooley, and really pleased to be here, being part of Courageous Conversations and having a really important conversation that we all need to be having.
So today's session, I want you to look after yourself while we go through this. We've all had many experiences, and often when we have these conversations, things can come up for all of us. So take care of yourself and take the time that you need.
So if we're going to talk about the issue of violence against women, which is so prevalent in our community, we need to start to talk about and understand the causes and what are the gender drivers of violence that actually leads to inequality and violence against women in our community. Because on any given day, you can open a newspaper, you can watch the news on TV, and you'll hear about a woman who's lost her life or women who have been abused in the home or on the street. And we need to start talking about how we can make a difference to that problem together. So we want to ask you, those who are doing this session, to have a think about what you believe or understand of the causes of violence against women. If you open the newspaper or look at the TV any day of the week, you'll see that too many circumstances where women either sadly lose their lives, or you hear about the many women across the country and across our community who are abused or experience violence every day. And if we're going to look at playing a part in preventing or stopping violence against women, we first have to look at the causes and understand where does violence against women actually come from. And part of that is understanding that there is a gendered nature to violence against women, and it's important that we look at these drivers and understand what they are. So we're going to ask you to consider a couple of the following statements, if you like, and think about which of these do you feel contributes to violence against women. So the social acceptance of violence against women, limits to women's independence and men's control in decision-making both in public and private life, stereotyped or rigid ideas of what makes masculinity and femininity, or the role of men and women in our society, or male friendships and male interactions that reinforce the idea of aggression and that might reinforce ideas of disrespect towards women. And of course, the answer is all of the above.
Absolutely. But let's unpack that a little bit, Liam, because that's a lot, right, to take in. So if we go back to looking at social acceptance, why do we think this one is violence against women? And I guess if we think about it as looking at seeing it all the time, we start to think of it as being normal, right? So if we see it in our everyday life, in our TV shows, on our media, we become desensitised. And so then when we see it in our lives, or if somebody's experiencing it, we kind of just blaze over and it becomes normal. That's kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's only if we can really take the time to think about that and make sure that we don't become desensitised to it, because we have to appreciate just the significance of the problem.
Do you want to talk about the next one?
Yeah, look, the limit to women's independence is something that is really ingrained in our community. It can be coming in different forms in terms of things like the gap of gender pay, or also the barriers to women having promotional or professional opportunities of men. But we can also see that in some family dynamics, the understanding that often men are the ones that control the financial decisions in the household, and a lot of the time we just assume that that's okay behaviour. Yeah.
Yeah, and stereotypes. So we're kind of they're inbred to us from really little. When I was little, I know I was told certain things. Yeah, I was told that women have to be the caregivers, not to get angry. That's not okay. What were you told when you were little? What was your stereotypes?
Look, I think a lot of men can appreciate that there's a stereotype that men need to be in control. We can't show any emotions. Big boys don't cry, and that's something that is really interesting because it's a big driver of violence against women. But it also is really unhealthy for men as well. So if men can start to look at increasing our understanding or broadening our understanding of what being a man is, to being caring, to being understanding, it goes a long way to stopping violence against women. But it's also much healthier for men and our relationships with ourselves and each other.
And if we unpack that just a little bit further, Liam, I was always told and reinforced to me that it's kind of my fault as a woman that if a man lashes out, that I'm driving that behaviour. And furthermore, if I dress a certain way, that I'm asking for it. And it's these stereotypes that we're trying to challenge, that we're saying that it's not women's fault the way they dress, or that it's these are the stereotypes that we want to say are not okay to continue to talk about, that they're not okay, that we continue to say that these are what we want in our community.
Yeah. And a big part of that, looking at male friendships and interactions and the way that can reinforce the problem. Men need to take responsibility for the way that we interact and influence other men in our lives, because young boys and men look to other boys and men to get examples of what is okay behaviour, what it is to be a man. So until men can start looking at what it means to be a man and how they can be positive role models to other men, we're not going to see men developing in that way and seeing a more healthy attitude in terms of how they treat women in their lives.
Both publicly and privately.
That's right, yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to watch a video by Our Watch, which is Violence Against Women, Change the Story. And what this does is it encapsulates all of these different gendered drivers we're talking about in a really powerful way. But it not only looks at the causes of violence against women, but it starts to look at some of the positive ways that we can all make a difference in creating a safer and more inclusive community for all women. So take a look.
This is the story of a boy and a girl. It's a universal story and an Australian story. It's a story that occurs every 2 minutes, in fact. A story that happens 657 times a day, every day of the year, and in every kind of household and every city and region across Australia. This is the biggest story behind violence against women. This story doesn't have a happy ending. Because this is the story of how gender inequality contributes to the murder of one Australian woman almost every week. Sounds like a tall tale, right? Let's take things back to the start. Here's the story of a regular woman. As a girl, she gets told how pretty she is, never how clever she is, that if she wears a short dress, she's asking for it. She grows up and gets used to being harassed by men on the street. That's just the way it is. Here's the story of a regular man. As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends his mum does the housework while dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where women are valued less and men are expected to be dominant and in control. In such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused, and violence against women is far more likely. But back to our story. The girl grows up into a woman, the boy grows into a man, and they begin to date. He jokes that he hopes she doesn't get fat now that we're together. She's not sure whether she should laugh. They have the same education and do similar work, yet he earns more money. He's quickly promoted, like other men in the company, while she gets overlooked. At home, she does all the household chores, and he takes control of their joint finances, seeing as he's the main breadwinner and all. When they're at the pub, he puts her down in front of his mates. His friends stay quiet. In the morning, he wakes up and blames the alcohol. And stress, he always has an excuse. When she gets pregnant, her boss says she can't come back part-time. After the baby is born, the lack of flexible job opportunities and childcare keeps her out of the workforce. She is socially isolated and financially dependent on him. He controls decision-making, and her. They are not equals. She is dependent on him for everything. So she never tells anyone that he has started to hit her. She doesn't say anything to her family or friends. She grows more isolated. She has nothing else but him, so she lives with the violence until their story ends, one way or another. This story isn't a one-off. It's a story shared by 1 in 4 Australian women who have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. And it's a story of 1 in 5 women since the age of 15 who experience sexual violence, including rape, 1 in 4 emotional violence, and 1 in 3 women physical violence. But it's also a story that affects children. More than half of the women who experienced violence had children in their care when the violence occurred. For victims and perpetrators, violence against women is the conclusion often reached after a life lived in a society where women and men aren't treated equally. But we, you and I, can change the narrative. Better education, policies, practices, support and funding can prevent this all too common story. When women and men have equal power, value, and opportunities in relationships and in society, violence against women is less likely. By nurturing caring, respectful, and equal relationships, and by creating equitable and inclusive communities, workplaces, and institutions, we can create a society of equality and respect, where violence against women is unthinkable. Let's change the story, because ending violence against women starts with gender equality.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. It really, when I watched that, it really challenged the way I was thinking about all the messages I was given when I was growing up. And I don't know about Liam, but I think when we talked about this earlier, it really challenges the way we see each other growing up as kids and what messages we want to give our kids.
Absolutely, and it's a really powerful way of taking all of these different factors and applying them in the story of a domestic relationship, which I think is a really powerful way of understanding it in a more simplified sense.
Yeah, and it's a great way to start a conversation,
Absolutely.
Isn't it? And be courageous in that as we go. Okay, so violence against women, it happens anywhere, even in our own street. It doesn't matter what nationality you are, what car you drive, what kind of house you're in. It doesn't matter what clothes you've got on. If you're in a house, it doesn't discriminate. It can be anywhere. It can be your mother, your sister. It can be your colleague. It can be your boss. It can be anybody. And this is why it is so important that we're having these conversations.
Absolutely. And it's a problem across all communities in Australia, which we know, but critically it's a problem in our community right here in Blacktown, Mount Druitt. And sadly, in May 2020, there were 3 women who lost their lives due to domestic homicide, and there was another woman who almost lost her life to murder. And what that really does is bring home that, you know, we talk about these women as statistics, but they're not just numbers, are they? And it's really hard not to get angry and frustrated that, you know, this is such a problem and women are losing their lives every day. Absolutely.
Shock, fear. I mean, the emotions that we go through when we hear these stories. Unfortunately, sometimes those emotions are quite quick. And so today we want to put some faces to those so that when we're talking about these statistics and we're talking about these stories, that you can be thinking about actual people. And as Liam said, in May we had 3 women who lost their lives and a 4th that almost lost her life. And so I'm going to talk about those stories. And I just want to add our warning again that sometimes hearing these stories can be triggers. So please take care of yourself as I share these stories today. So Arinda was 69-year-old and she lived at Woodcroft. On May 2nd, 2020, she was murdered. Her husband of 44 years has charged with murder. Jaquita is 38 years old and she lived in Heversham. On May 5th, 2020, her husband was charged with using poison so as to endanger her life, which is considered domestic violence, and common assault, also domestic violence. Jaquita thankfully survived. Kamaljeet was 27 years old, lived in Quakers Hill. On May 20th, 2020, she was murdered. Her husband of 4 years was charged with the murder. Ruth was 22 years old and lived in Bidwell. On May 30th, 2020, she was murdered by her ex-partner. He then committed suicide. All 4 of these women are real stories and they live in our communities. And these are the faces and names and stories we want you to remember when we're talking about courageous conversations.
And when we're having these difficult conversations, one question that we often get asked is what about violence against men? And statements that say, well, men experience violence too. And it's really important to acknowledge that is true. Men do experience violence, and it's really important that men who experience violence, no matter what the context, get the support that they need. But when you start to look at the statistics and you look at the difference in experiences of men and women's violence, you can start to understand why it's important that Courageous Conversations is talking about violence against women. So generally men who experience violence, they are much more likely to experience it in a public place and committed by someone who's a stranger or maybe even just an acquaintance. But often when women, and most overwhelmingly when women experience violence, it happens in the home, and it's someone who someone who says that they've loved them or someone who's meant to love them, and it's from a partner or a family member. And regardless of what context you talk about, whether it's men experiencing violence or women experiencing violence, most often males are the perpetrator, and that's an overwhelming statistic. So now we're going to watch a video that brings together some of those statistics and those differences of experience between men and women and how they experience violence. So take a look.
It is about gender. And the reality is that most victims are female. People will say that 25% of victims of domestic violence are men, and that's true. But over 60% of those cases, the offender is still a man.
We now have 2 women a week being murdered.
So far this year, 77 women have lost their lives.
We have 1 in 3 women.
Above the age of 16 will experience physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime.
And we have 1 in 4 children are affected.
If you're a man, highly likely you are going to be assaulted on a footpath either before or after leaving a licensed premises. These are the facts, ladies and gentlemen. If you're a woman, you are going to be assaulted at home, and it is going to be at the hands of someone who says, I love you.
It's a very powerful video, and listening to the police talk about the hard facts is really harrowing, I guess. And I think from my perspective, it shows that while, as you said, while men are victims of violence, in more cases than not, they are the perpetrator, and that is why we're talking about women today. In 2019, 74 women were killed. 63 of these murders were the result of violent relationships. 59 of the murders were perpetrated by male suspects, and 9 of the murders were perpetrated by female suspects. In 2019, 160 men were killed. 13 of these murders were the end result of violent relationships. 151 of these murders were perpetrated by male suspects, and only 8 were perpetrated by female suspects. These are the hard facts. And while they speak for themselves, I think that we have covered today why we are focused on women and the violence that is perpetrated against them by male perpetrators.
So when we look at those statistics here in the graph, we can just see the huge proportion of men as perpetrators of violence and murder across Australia, and that's regardless of whether it's women and men. But what we want to do is highlight that it's not all men who are violent. You know, these statistics can almost paint that picture, and it can seem very damning, if you like, but it's not the case where we want all men to feel shame for these kind of statistics. It's about men understanding that it's only a small proportion of men who perpetrate the majority of violence, but all men have a responsibility in being role models to other men and calling out sexist and inappropriate language and creating a culture where any abuse against women is not okay, because it's only when we start to change that culture that we can hope to see the terrible statistics around women losing their life start to go down.
Absolutely. And to that point, everybody plays a part. And so we're going to hit to a video now, and you can see real men in our community and what they are doing. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. I love watching that video because it talks about everybody has a role, everybody can do something, and it doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be mind-blowing. You don't have to change the world. Every single person and every single piece that we do does change the world and does change our community, and you have something to offer. And that's what we wanted to talk about today, is that we can all do something. Absolutely. Isn't that right, Liam? We can do something to change the world. And so we want to talk about what that can be. And it really is about 4 simple things. It's about getting educated, and that's why you've joined us here today, is to listen to us and talk about some pretty heavy things today. And so thanks for sticking with us and going on that journey. But it's about learning about what are the true drivers, what's out there, what is actually changing our community, and changing that violence against women. We want to stop that, and we want to know what that is, what's driving it and what's making that happen. We want to be confident. You need to know, and you want to know, how do I understand this? What can I do? And I want to be strong, and I want to feel confident about doing that. And now you can be, and now you know this is what's changing it, and now I can do something about that. And being confident feels good, and it makes you know that you can do something. And when you feel confident, you can walk into any situation and you can go, okay, I know how I can be here. And then you want to be informed, and you want to be able to share your knowledge. And so you want to know where the services are, so that if you come across your friend, your sister, your mother, or anybody that is having a rough time or shares with you a story, then you know where to send them, and you know where they can go for help, and you know where to give them, what advice to give them. And that is that here is the information that they can have. So being informed about the services that are in your local area, and then be active. Tell everyone, spread the message, get on your soapbox, get out there, yell it to the rooftops that it's not okay and you're not going to stand for it anymore. Be safe and look after each other. Be courageous. And it's about changing the world one step at a time.
Absolutely. And so well said. I think it's just about taking the messages that you've learned today and all of the messages that we have in our various sessions that you can take advantage of. And the fact that you're here learning about this, having these conversations with us, is a really big step. So thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. So the next session in Courageous Conversations is where does violence against women start? And I hope you can join us for that one as well.